anime commentary with Japanese TV and film in the 1960s. Returning champion, welcome back to Anime Lockdown.
Oh, thanks for having me. As I said, this is a presentation on Japanese television and film in the 1960s. Japan at the time, so here's some historical context for Japan in the 1960s, give an overall image of what society was like at the time. Japan had been devastated by World War II, with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and their surrender to the Allied forces. Between then and the 1960s, Japan recovered economically. And by the 1960s, they had a great economic resurgence, and the decade became known as the Golden 60s as a result. There were a few protests that happened at this time, the most notable one being the Ampo protest, I think the largest protest in modern Japanese history. It was a demonstration against a revision of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty that year. The treaty ultimately was revised, but the prime minister at the time, Nobusuke Kishi, severely mishandled the event, and he ultimately resigned. He was succeeded by Hayato Ikeda, who you can see on the left. Ikeda introduced an economic policy known as the income doubling plan that would help further improve the economy by the end of the decade. He would introduce tax breaks and that sort of thing. Some notable events that occurred in the 1960s, I mentioned the Ampo protests. Another big one that year was the assassination of Inajiro Asanuma. Asanuma was the head of the Japan Socialist Party at the time. During a televised debate, right-wing nationalists suddenly charged him and killed him with a sword. And this became a huge discussion in Japan at the time. The Ampo protest, for a note, the protest that ultimately led to the emergence of the New Left, which was the more radical left movement during the 1960s. That would ultimately lead to some university protests in 1968 and 1969. The left, these protests would ultimately result in the left having poor public perception. The Japan Socialist Party lost 51 seats in the Diet in the election in 1969. And that would ultimately also lead to help influence the feminist women's liberation movement in the 1970s, who felt they weren't being treated equally in the protests in the previous decade. The miners' strike of 1960, another major one, involved a coal mine. Mitsui, who controlled a lot of coal mines around 1960, they were contemplating laying off thousands of workers due to Ikeda's income doubling plan going to support oil and petrochemicals, and thus that they would not provide as much support coal. The Shimanaki incident is a sort of a bizarre one. This involved a right-wing nationalist breaking into the house of the president of a magazine and severely injuring his wife, and I think killed the maid as well. He did that because the magazine published a story that featured a dream sequence where the emperor was beheaded, and that led to a general social taboo against depictions of the imperial family in fiction. In 1964, two notable events: the Summer Olympics held in Tokyo, and also the introduction of the Shinkansen, or bullet train. The first one was Tokaido Shinkansen, as you can see here. One interesting note about the Summer Olympics: the bearer of the torch was selected because he was born on August 6th, 1945, the day the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. They did this because they wanted people to remind people of the past and strive for world peace. Also, in 1966, this became the first year in what was known as the My Car era, because the automotive industry had a milestone of 10 million in car sales. It was also the introduction of the Toyota Corolla that same year. And in 1968, the first issue of Weekly Shonen Jump was published. This became one of the biggest manga magazines in Japanese history. A lot of very popular works, such as Dragon Ball, Yu Yu Hakusho, debuted within the pages of Weekly Shonen Jump. Now, to discuss television. Television was introduced in early 1950, shortly after the war. Initially, television sets were placed in public places, such as train stations, because most people couldn't afford them at the time. But as television sets became more affordable, households that could receive broadcasts increased. And to give some perspectives, you can see here, in 1953, only 866 households could receive broadcasts. That would increase to approximately 50,000 by 1955. The 1960s also saw what is known as Golden Time, which was a period of the broadcast day between 7 and 9 p.m. A lot of popular programs such as children's shows, quiz shows, and baseball broadcasts would be typically shown during this time. To give a few examples of shows that were introduced in the 1960s, the first one here is Asadora, or aka Renzoku Terebi Shosetsu. This is an annual drama anthology that began in 1961 and is still being produced to this day. Each year they would have this sort of special drama. They're all unique stories. They're not connected to each other narratively at all. The very first one was The Daughter in Me, or Musume to Watashi, 1961. The most recent one last year was Come Come Everybody, and that was the 105th series. That same year came Mina no Uta, which is a collection of music videos. They were typically 5 minutes long, broadcast by the NHK. They featured a lot of popular songs. It's still being produced. Whenever the station had 5 extra minutes of broadcast time, they would play one of these songs. Vast majority of them are animated. There were a few early on that were live action, but by the 1980s, the animation was by far the most popular format. 1962, there was Onimitsukenshi, aka the Samurai, which ran until 1965 for 128 episodes. It stars Koichi Osei as the samurai detective. He is the brother to the shogun. Initially, the producers wanted 4 distinct stories with their own protagonists, but Osei's character, the detective, ended up being so popular that they redesigned the series to feature him exclusively, and became popular enough that they made 2 films, both released in 1964. 1963, there were 2 important shows that both animated that came out that year. One of them was Tetsuo and Adam, aka Astro Boy. This was based off of a manga by Osamu Tezuka. At the time, Tezuka established his own studio called Mushi Productions, and this show was developed through Mushi Production. This was the first anime to be distributed internationally. It became known as Astro Boy in the United States. It features an android named Adam, aka Astro Boy, who is the creation of a scientist who lost his son in a traffic accident. However, he is sold to a circus, where he is adopted by another professor, who you see on the right. one historical note here, this helped introduce the idea of sponsorship for anime shows. The sponsor for this specific show was the Meiji Confectionery Company, which produced candy and chocolate. That same year, Tetsujin 28-Go, aka Gigantor as it was known in the United States, ran until 1966. This became significant because it was the first televised mecha series. The eponymous mech was operated externally by remote. Subsequent mecha productions would have a pilot in the cockpit, so Gigantor was pretty much the only notable example of a mecha who was operated externally. The sponsor for this series was Glico, the manufacturers of Pocky, who would feature the robot on their product. 1966, the first of the Ultra series debuted. This was produced by Suburia Productions. This studio was created by Eiji Suburia, who was famous for his work on the Godzilla films. This happened to be the most expensive television production ever made at the time, and it followed the story of 3 human beings, a photojournalist and 2 pilots, as they explored various unusual occurrences throughout the country. As an interesting aside, Ultra Q's title was inspired by the 1964 Summer Olympics. It was originally going to be called Unbalanced, but somebody at Tokyo Broadcasting System, or TBS, suggested renaming it. He was inspired by an interview by a gymnast around the time of the 64 Olympics who introduced the term Ultra C. This was the term he used to describe the Japanese team's determination at the Olympics. And the term is a reference to the grading system that they used to gauge difficulty for games at the Olympic ceremony, A, B, and C, A being the easiest, C being the most difficult. The term became a popular buzzword at the time, and that was inspired TBS to name it Ultra Q. 2 weeks later, Ultraman debuted. This was the first show in the series to have an Ultraman character. The character is a Shinhaya Hayata, a member of the Science Patrol, merges with Ultraman, who is an alien from the N78 Nebula. He was pursuing another alien to Earth. The two merge, and Hayata is able to transform into Ultraman through the use of the Beta Capsule, a special device that was granted to him by the Ultraman alien. By this point, TBS had some stipulations they wanted Suburia Productions to follow. One was that the show would be produced in color to make it more appealing to the American market. They also wanted monsters because in Ultra Q, the episodes of Ultra Q that featured monsters happened to be the most popular, and they wanted to replicate that success with Ultraman. They also wanted to have a heroic figure who would fight the monsters and protect Earth. Interestingly enough, the Ultraman figure was originally going to be designed to look like a Karasu Tengu, a bird-like goblin from Japanese folklore, and the series was originally called Science Special Search Team Bemlar. However, TBS weren't fond of the original design, so they asked them to make it look more humanoid, so people be more easily able to distinguish the hero from the villains he fought. This is where the current design you see with Ultraman developed. The show was then retitled Science Special Search Team Redman, and then became Ultraman. Another key show was Key Hunter, broadcast between 1968 and 1973. This was notable for being the breakthrough performance of Sonny Chiba, who appears as an ex-reporter in the series. He would have a great career as an action star in subsequent years. People who see Kill Bill might recognize him for his role in the film. And one more notable film, Mito Komo, and this is the longest-running Jidaigeki, or period piece in Japanese history. It ran from 1969 to 2011. The main character is based on real-life figure Tokugawa Mitsukune, who was a grandson of Tokugawa Ieyasu, who established a Tokugawa shogunate in the 17th century. Mitsukune would travel around the country, correcting any injustices that he encountered along the way. Some other notable programs that were developed. One was Osamatsu-kun. The first series produced in 1966. There was a recent series based on the same manga. Another one, Dororo. So note, Dororo is the first series in what became known as World Masterpiece Theater, which were group of series that were based on literature. Dororo was pretty much the only one based on a manga. Others were based on Western literature. Gegege no Kitaro, the first series, was released in 1968. This was based off of a manga. The character of Kitaro originated in the 1930s as part of a storytelling tradition known as Kamishibai. And then with this storytelling tradition, itinerant storytellers would travel around the country, and they would carry this box with them with various illustrations that were meant to show different scenes of the story that they were telling. And that's where Kitaro originated. Now, going into films, this was a pretty prolific period for Japanese studios. Most of the films were released as double bills at the time. Half of the double bill were usually known as program pictures. Those were the B movies that were made pretty quickly in about a month. Television's popularity at the time led to a dramatic decrease in theater attendance. To show this, in 1960, there was 1.2 billion people attended the theater, but this would decline to around 200 million by 1980. As a way of combating this and encouraging people to attend the theater more often, the studios would produce films that would show stuff like violence that would not be allowed on television at the time. And also, the note, Yasujiro Ozu, who was a very important director who had been making stuff since the 30s, he passed away in 1963. He released his final film, An Autumn Afternoon, a year prior. Akira Kurosawa, who established his fame with films like Rashomon and Seven Samurai, was having great difficulty in the 1960s. He had struggled with work and allegedly had health issues. The film Tora 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 didn't do well at all, and he would attempt suicide in 1971. However, he survived and he continued producing films into the 1990s. This was also an era of popularity of the Yakuza films that would continue into the 1970s. One important development in this period was the Japanese New Wave. This was sort of a loosely associated group of directors. They were at this period lasted between the 1950s and 1970s. Directors associated with the movement were exploring more controversial themes, as you can see here, like Korean discrimination, sexual violence, that sort of thing. One of the biggest names in this new wave was Seijun Suzuki. Suzuki had established himself as a director of Yakuza films, but one event that ended up being pretty important was his dismissal from Tokusatsu following the release of Branded to Kill in 1967. The president of Tokusatsu at the time just didn't like him and didn't like the fact that the movie didn't really make any money. Suzuki ultimately sued, and he sued successfully for breach of contract, but that resulted in him getting blacklisted from the industry for about 10 years. During the lawsuit, two details emerged about Tokusatsu. First, the company brought in Suzuki to direct Branded to Kill because another project suddenly got canceled. And second, the company was seriously in debt, and they tried to cover it up. They were about 1.8 billion yen in debt at the time, and they were really restructuring. So the president was really kind of using Suzuki as a scapegoat for all of this. Some of his other films include Tokyo Drifter and Man with a Shotgun. Nagisa Oshima, another person associated with the Japanese New Wave, he began his career in 1959 with a 7-minute short known as Tomorrow's Sun. One of his films, Night and Fog in Japan, was suddenly pulled from theater distribution because of the assassination of Asanuma in 1960. One major event in his life was the time he visited South Korea in 1964, which strengthened his anger towards anti-Korean bigotry in Japan at the time, and that would influence the film Death by Hanging, which shows the execution of a man who killed 2 people. The main character was a Korean man. I think it was based on a real incident, and he wanted to explore the nature of discrimination and guilt in Japanese society at the time. Another major figure, Shohei Matsumoto. He's currently the only Japanese director to receive 2 Palme d'Or awards, one for The Ballad of Narayama and another for The Eel. He began his career as an assistant to Yasujiro Ozu before becoming the director. He also established the Japan Institute for the Moving Image in the 1970s, and that was where horror director Takashi Miike, who was famous for films like Audition, received his first film credit in 1987. Imamura specifically was known for films like A Man Vanishes and Profound Desire of the Gods, the latter of which was about Japan's social periphery. Going into specific films, at this time there was a fairly long-running series of films about the character Zatoichi. Shintaro Katsu stars in all of these films. There were 26 total between 1962 and 1989. Katsu stars as Zatoichi, a blind masseur who wields a sword disguised as a cane. As an interesting note, one of the films features Toshiro Mifune, who was famous for his work with Akira Kurosawa. The movie was called Zatoichi Meets Yojimbo, and it's a reference to the film Yojimbo, directed by Kurosawa in 1961. Takashi Kitano directed his own film called Zatoichi in 2003, and he stars himself as the protagonist. Another entry, this was another really long-running one, 48 films. Stars Kiyoshi Atsumi as Torajiro or Toro-san. The series began life as a television series in 1968. The series ended when Torajiro died of a snake bite. A lot of the audience was rather upset about him dying, so they decided to make the first film, called It's Tough Being a Man, in 1969, to continue Tora-san's story. The final film was released in 1995. There was another film that was made after that in 2019, after Atsumi died. But it includes flashbacks to the previous films. One note about this film was that each film has a female lead. These female leads were known collectively as the Madonnas. Now, Godzilla. In 1962, the third film in the Godzilla franchise, King Kong vs. Godzilla, was released. This was the most highly attended Godzilla film ever made, and its success motivated the studio behind it, Toei, to continue making more films featuring Godzilla. This was also the decade that introduced King Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, in 1964. However, subsequent films didn't do too well. And this sort of era ended with Terror of Mechagodzilla in 1975, and it would be another 10 years before another Godzilla film would be made, as Return of Godzilla in 1985. Sayuki. This was a 1960 film. There was an adaptation of Journey to the West, the classic Chinese novel. The edited American version was known as Alakazam the Great, and it was released in 1961 in the United States in 1961. Sort of one big note was a popular singer at the time, Frankie Avalon, provided the singing voice of the son Goku, who was renamed Alakazam. Modern fans might recognize Journey to the West as the inspiration for the series Dragon Ball, created by Akira Toriyama in 1986. One cool little detail about Sayuki was that Osamu Tezuka was involved in promoting the film. He posed for publicity photos, and the film motivated him to try his hand at animation. He established Mushi Production shortly afterward. I mentioned Kurosawa before. One of the films he released in the 1960s was Yojimbo, starring Toshiro Fune as the character Sanjuro, this wandering Ronin. It became so popular that it received a sequel, Sanjuro, the following year. This influenced two films. One was A Fistful of Dollars, and the other is Last Man Standing. The latter film stars Bruce Willis, is set in the Depression. It follows the same story, but it's the same general story, but it's set in the 1930s, I think. As I mentioned, Kurosawa, his career sort of had a big low, and a huge low point in the 1960s following the success of Yojimbo. The film Tora ended up faring poorly, didn't do nearly as well as he'd hoped, but he would eventually rebound and continue making films in the 80s and 90s. Some notable films that came out during this time, I mentioned Yojimbo and Sanjuro by Akira Kurosawa. Kuroneko, that was a horror film released in 1968. Branded to Kill, and that was Suzuki. That I mentioned that got him dismissed from Nikatsu. There's also Onibaba, another horror film released in 1964. Kwaidan, released in 1965, was an adaptation of a collection of folk tales published by Lafcadio Hearn in the early 20th century. Some more films that were released. There was The Human Vapor, I think that was directed by Ishiro Honda, a science fiction film. Night and Fog in Japan, as I mentioned. that was suddenly pulled from theatrical distribution because of the assassination of Asanuma that year. Death by Hanging, that was by Oshima, about the execution of a Korean man. And also, It's Tough Being a Man. I mentioned that's the inaugural film in the Tora-san franchise. We also had a few Yakuza films made that year. We also have a couple of samurai films, such as the Three Outlaw Samurai and The Sword of Doom. And also, the Zatoichi began in 1962 with The Tale of Zatoichi. Its sequel was released the same year. And that's concludes my presentation. If anybody has any questions, I'll be willing to answer.
Hey, let's take a look at the chat. Probably give them a couple seconds to catch up. There's usually a 20 to 30 second delay on Zoom. I'm seeing a lot of clapping from our moderator and Golden Pelt, it looks like. Somebody is asking if there will be a link to the films referenced. I assume they mean where they can watch them.
I can provide some, sure. Some of them, like Jimbo, that was released through the Criterion, had a release of that film, as well as Sanjuro, and had Sword of Doom was by Criterion. You can probably find some on like Amazon as well. No, HBO has, I think, some of these films, I think. I have to look them up.
Let's see, Rev Tobias says, very informative, thank you. Bebop Shock Infinite says, Jonathan Clements is a frequent collaborator with Helen McCarthy.
Yeah, I think I remember that.
Lot of thank yous. Lots of Ultraman is available from Shout Factory.
Yeah, I have some of that. I know that Mill Creek Entertainment's released several of the earliest Ultraman shows. I have, I think, the first 5 myself on Blu-ray.
Nice. More people thanking you. Harley Jin, thank you, very informative. 3 purple hearts. I think that's how you get discharged from the military, I think. That was a bad joke. Let's see. This is from Ian WH. Most of, if not all of the films mentioned are available on Criterion. I think you just said that as well. Gaming Anachronism says, were any of the films from the era motivated by an instance of right-wing nationalism violence of the era that you mentioned?
I think a few of them know that Death by Hanging was influenced by, you mentioned Oshima visiting South Korea. He was rather angry and upset about how Koreans were treated by the Japanese, or a lot of bigotry towards the Koreans at the time, and he explored that with Death by Hanging. Nice.
More people saying thank you. Rider Strike says happy pre-Ultraman Day. I believe, yeah, they're doing not to advertise somebody else's show, but there's a big like Ultraman event this weekend, I believe.
Oh, cool.
On tokusatsu, Shoutsu, I think is what it's called. I want to say that's a streaming channel on Pluto, but I don't have all the information. You would have to look that up on your own.
Yeah, I think it is a streaming service. I don't think I've seen that before.
I know some of our panelists are participating in I'm pretty sure in that. Mike Toole, I believe, is in there, and I think Kevin Derendorf, I think is his name. He's probably in there. And then a good friend of mine, Mike Dent. I keep advertising for somebody else's thing. Stay on Anime Lockdown. Never leave. Cool. Well, we'll see. We'll give people a couple more minutes, and then if everybody's done asking questions, we can wrap it up. Mm-hmm. Do you have you might have already shown this. I was clicking around in the chat. Do you have a blog or a Twitter that you would like to advertise?
Yeah, my Twitter is Anime Commentary. People can follow me on there. I do have a blog called As I also have a blog called Anime Commentary Again .wordpress.com. So if anybody wants to follow me there, they're welcome to do so.
Awesome. Gaming Anachronism, I may have said their name wrong before, says, were any of the films influenced by student protests?
I'm not entirely sure. They're probably, I'm not sure which ones any specifically, but they just know that the protests at the time, there's just a lot of leftist movements. And I'll have to look into it more often to see if there were any that were specifically influenced by the protests. Zozo249
says, how come so many samurai or samurai heavy stories / characters coming out of the 60s?
Not really sure on the samurai. I guess the samurai characters still was a really popular genre. Samurai film was pretty popular genre. This goes back, I think, the 1920s. Know that there was one film made in the 1920s called Jiraiya the Brave, which was about the ninja Jiraiya. And they've been developing this for a fairly long while.
It's definitely an era that I need to watch more media from. I've not seen very many older films. Let's see. Let me make sure I'm pronouncing this right. Racisis, I think. Similar question. Why so many Yakuza movies?
Yakuza, that's when the odd one caused them. Yakuza, thinking that during this time, just the Yakuza were being more prominent in society, that at the time, the 60s were known for what are known as the chivalrous Yakuza films. They were more chivalrous and upstanding. But by the 1970s, we started seeing more stuff like battles without honor and humanity. The more violent side of the Yakuza became popular in subsequent decades.
Bokusachi has a comment. Really interesting to learn more about this political landscape of the time. There was some wild stuff going on. Renesis, maybe? Films could reflect the societal movement stirred up by protests, but I don't think I can recall of any films directly about the protests. Bebop Shock says Horus Prince of the Sun, I believe, has some themes in it that came from the student movements. Mike Toole did the commentary on that movie, so that might be a question for him, is what they're saying. Zozo, you never hear much about Japan in the 60s, so thank you for this panel. Definitely something I'll look more into.
Thanks for stopping by, everyone.
Yeah, this is great. I'm really really happy with how this con is shaping up so far. We've got over 80 people at our first panel. One of our panelists before we started is like, I really hope we get at least 50. And I think that we've blown that out of the water so far. I'm going to give just a couple more minutes. I'll wait until the delay catches up to see if anybody has any more comments or questions. Otherwise, I think we can wrap this up unless you had anything else.
Not really. If there are any more questions, I can answer them.
Are you in the Discord as well? If people had questions later? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, it looks like, let's see, lots of influence, French Revolution, Daryl Surratt, a lot of filmography of Mamoru Oshii references the student protest. Poppy says, delayed on Twitch? Never. It's interesting. It seems to depend on which platform you use.
Yeah.
My TV, which I have just so I can make sure everything is working, has a pretty significant delay. But if I watch in a browser, there's almost no delay. It's very interesting. Harley Jin, thank you for the panel. Mobile. They're saying mobile is always 60 to 120 seconds behind. Okay. Well, I think that about does it. If anybody has any questions or comments after the fact, you can find Anime Commentary in the Discord. Otherwise, I really appreciate you coming back this year. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
You have a nice day.
You too.